Welcome to the channel, I'm GM Gregor, and in this video I'm going to provide an overview of the Warhammer 40,000 role-playing games that are available. Over the past decade, tabletop role-playing games have exploded in popularity, and with Warhammer 40,000 starting to see mainstream success, more and more people are asking about these 40k role-playing games, as it can get a bit confusing as there are 7 of these games on the market. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the different 40k role-playing games out there to help you understand what's available and maybe decide which one you might be interested in trying out. In the next video, I'll discuss the factors to consider when choosing which game to play, but for now, let's get up to speed with what games are actually available. The first Warhammer 40,000 RPG to be published was Dark Heresy. Technically, the first printing of the rulebook was actually published by Black Industries, the now defunct role-playing arm of Games Workshop's Black Library, but that's a history lesson for another time. Dark Heresy puts players in the roles of agents serving the Imperial Inquisition. It's often described as Call of Cthulhu in space, which in my opinion is a good comparison. The game has a heavy focus on investigation and supernatural horror as you try to put an end to the various threats facing the Imperium. The game involves players investigating secret cults that worship the dark gods or are in league with dangerous aliens, and the game is renowned for its lethal combat. Players don't play the hero level characters that are often the focus of other games, but are instead regular humans recruited by the Inquisition to investigate the horrors of the universe, and they have to rely on their wits to survive each encounter. Even characters who somehow survive the horrors thrown at them will likely either go insane and have to retire, or will succumb to the corrupting influences they once faced, and find themselves hunted down by those they once served, thanks to the extensive sanity and corruption mechanics that are a feature of the game. Dark Heresy's rules system is based on the D100 system first used in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is Games Workshop's old world fantasy based RPG. This means it uses percentile dice instead of the common D20 that other players might be used to from perhaps games such as Dungeons & Dragons. When attempting a given action that requires a skill test, for example trying to sneak past a hostile guard or pick a locked door, the Games Master gives the player a target to roll under, and if they manage to do that, they succeed. Whilst this basic mechanic is quite simple, the game itself is actually pretty in-depth, especially in combat. There are a lot of different mechanics to interact with, and players have access to a huge armory with lots of different types of weapons and equipment, each with their own rules. Most RPGs fall somewhere on a spectrum, with super light rules, heavily narrative focused games on one end, and technical simulationist style games which try to capture as many factors as possible and represent them mechanically on the other end of the spectrum. Dark Heresy, and as a result the rest of the RPGs produced by Fantasy Flight Games for Warhammer 40,000, tend to lean towards the latter, but they're far from the most complicated games on the market. They're more complicated than say Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but they're well within the capabilities of most people to play and run as their first game. Dark Heresy in the whole was well received by the player base, and an additional 18 books were released for the system. Following the success of Dark Heresy, Fantasy Flight Games went on to produce the second game on our list, Rogue Trader. Instead of playing as agents serving the Inquisition, players now play as a rogue trader and their crew. Think of a rogue trader as a mixture of ship captain, explorer, trader, and sometimes pirate. They're given a huge spaceship with a crew which numbers in the tens of thousands and a large sector of space to explore. Mechanically, Rogue Trader uses the same rule set from Dark Heresy, but with refinements born out through years of playing, such as a completely overhauled system for psychic powers, and newer mechanics needed for Rogue Trader's settings such as starship combat, and a new economy system to represent the fact that each player has access to more money than Jeff Bezos. While definitely dated in some aspects, Rogue Trader has stood the test of time and is still very popular amongst the player base. It stands out from the rest of the line because of the amount of freedom and power players have compared to the other games. Players have the opportunity to travel to new worlds, meet new alien species and conquer planets, all in the name of profit, which is quite the rarity for characters to do within the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Personally speaking, Rogue Trader is one of my favourite games in this line. Admittedly, some of the mechanics were improved by later games, but the setting and the scale of it all provide some very memorable experiences. If you're an experienced games master, especially one who's looking to introduce the Warhammer 40,000 setting to new players, I would definitely recommend this game as it provides both a light-hearted aspect of what is otherwise a very grim universe, and it provides that going on an adventure feeling that a lot of people look for in their role-playing games. If you're new to being a games master, however, I wouldn't recommend Rogue Trader, at least not without some very heavy caveats. Players literally have access to a starship and a whole sector of space. They have a lot more freedom in this game than is normal, so games masters need to be prepared to think on their feet when players find themselves either intentionally or accidentally jumping to an area of space many millions of light years away from the intended adventure. An additional 15 books were published for the system, providing players with plenty of content for their adventures. In 2010, Fantasy Flight Games released Deathwatch. It again builds upon the rules system of the previous two games but is very different in tone. Whereas Dark Heresy had players investigating heretical cults and Rogue Trader focused on adventure and freedom, Deathwatch focused on one thing: murder. Players take control of Warhammer 40,000's iconic protagonists, the genetically engineered superhuman warrior monks better known as Space Marines. Gameplay focuses heavily on combat, with players tasked with putting an end to significant threats to the Imperium, such as the destruction of an entire Tyranid hive fleet. With players now in control of Space Marines, the game introduced new mechanics to fully flesh out this experience. The lethal combat levels of the other 40k RPGs was maintained by introducing more powerful enemies, as well as introducing rules for enemies that come in larger hordes capable of killing Space Marines simply through sheer numbers. The game also focuses on teamwork and cooperation with the addition of solo and squad modes. Players in solo modes get a bonus, usually based on the chapter their Marine hails from, to help them focus on doing their jobs alone, but if the character joins squad mode, each character in the squad can use a range of tactical abilities that benefit the entire group in much more significant ways than in solo mode. Also, as characters progress and gain experience together, they can learn the unique tactical abilities of other members from other chapters as they bond and grow as a team together. The game was well supported, receiving an additional 12 books and several free additional downloads, so there is plenty of content available. A lot of people ask about Deathwatch as their first 40k RPG because practically everybody wants to play a Space Marine at some point. With an experienced games master running the game, this shouldn't be a problem, but personally I recommend starting with one of the other games, as Deathwatch is a very rules intensive system which takes the most complicated parts of the other games, the combat, and then makes it the primary focus. Additionally, newer players might become confused or disappointed by the lack of Primaris Marines, as the game, both in-universe and real life, came out before the creation of said Primaris Marines and the Indomitus Crusade. With the initial 3 games that had first been announced by Black Industries and fulfilled by Fantasy Flight Games now released, players were left wondering what was next in store. In 2011, that question was answered with a surprising choice when Fantasy Flight Games announced Black Crusade, a game which for the first time put the players in the position as the most stereotypically evil faction in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the Servants of Chaos. Like the previous games before it, the core rules of Black Crusade were effectively an iteration of the rules system first laid down in Dark Heresy, which were then further refined in Rogue Trader and Deathwatch. However, Black Crusade was also the first game which marked a change in the philosophy of the game's design. Combat balance was given a new focus, and the rules system in general, particularly the parts of the game involving character skills and talents, were streamlined for ease of use, with multiple skills being rolled into fewer, larger skills. For example, rather than having the concealment skill for hiding yourself, the silent move skill for moving around quietly, and the shadowing skill for following someone at a distance, all 3 of these skills were wrapped into the new stealth skill. Due to this change in design philosophy, the games can be thought of as belonging to one of 2 generations, with Dark Heresy, Rogue Trader and Deathwatch being Generation 1, and Black Crusade and the 2 games that followed it being Generation 2. Whilst all the games across both generations are compatible with each other, it is generally easier to borrow material from other games within the same generation, but don't let that concern you, as even across generations it's still relatively easy to port material from one game to another. It's worth mentioning that the Generation 2 games also had less additional publications released after the core books, and whilst at the time it was speculated that this was because Fantasy Flight Games was diverting development resources to their upcoming Star Wars RPGs, it should be noted that the Generation 2 games still very much feel like complete systems. Going back to Black Crusade, players now play the role of corrupted humans and Chaos Space Marines actively working against the Imperium. Rather than serving humanity, players in Black Crusade predominantly serve themselves and seek the favour of the Chaos Gods. Players now have their own meta goals in addition to the story created by the Games Master, as each character is seeking to ascend to immortal demonhood or perhaps lead a huge army known as a Black Crusade against the Imperium before they themselves are killed or are overwhelmed by the gifts granted to them by the ruinous powers. In a similar manner to Rogue Trader, Black Crusade encourages a sandbox style of gameplay and introduces a number of new mechanics to the line. Gaining followers and creating a personal retinue is a large part of the system, as is the way you align yourself to the different Chaos Gods depending on your in-game actions. Black Crusade also provides ways of converting your characters from the other 40k RPGs into Black Crusade. This provides players a fun way of continuing the story of their existing characters that had fallen from grace by maxing out their corruption track. This is a far more interesting fate than simply being retired from play. Unsurprisingly, given the theme of Black Crusade, the content of this game is perhaps best reserved for mature players, as at times it can be a very dark game, especially for those not familiar with the Warhammer 40,000 setting. However, it doesn't actually have to play like that if you don't want it to. The introductory adventure, for example, sets an excellent precedent for how Black Crusade can be played, as both the story and the theme of it are much more like the sword and sorcery classic Conan the Barbarian, albeit with power armor and chainswords. Proving they were not yet done with the line, in 2012, Fantasy Flight Games released Only War. At the time, it was also considered a surprising choice like with Black Crusade, because just like Black Crusade and Deathwatch before it, Only War is another one of the more combat-focused 40k RPG experiences, this time emphasizing combat from the perspective of a regular human serving in the Imperial Guard. Only War presented a very refined and slick version of the 40k RPG core rules, and offers players the chance to create their own, unique Imperial Guard regiment from which they can create their characters, if one of the many pre-established regiments did not appeal to them, and then face the horrors of the galaxy without the training, war gear, or biological advantages that the Space Marines of the Deathwatch have. While naturally focused on combat, there's a variety of different adventures you can have with this system depending on the type of guard regiment your characters hail from. The default regiment fighting style is naturally line infantry, but you can also make armoured regiments, scout regiments, mechanised regiments, among others depending on the style of game your group desires. On a personal level, this is the game I've got the least experience with. I have played it, but I'm not hugely into the theme of this. However, I can attest to the fact that the rules are among the cleanest in the 40k RPGs we've looked at so far, and I know that generally speaking, those that play Only War are fond of it. Finally, in 2014, Fantasy Flight Games launched their last game in the 40k role-playing line, Dark Heresy 2nd Edition. This 2nd edition of Dark Heresy was a further iteration of the rules last developed by Only War, and is almost mechanically identical, but with the addition of new rules to better fit the role of player acolyte serving an Inquisitor. Improved social interaction mechanics were introduced, new subtlety mechanics, which changes the way the game world reacts around the players depending on how stealthily or not they conduct their investigations, were also among the additions to the game. The character creation rules were also further refined, and with them, players are effectively able to create almost any character they can think of, which makes the job of updating the previous 40k RPG games to the Dark Heresy 2nd edition rule set a lot easier. Whilst a further iteration of Only War, the 2nd edition of Dark Heresy is significantly different from the 1st edition. As is common in almost any game that goes through multiple editions, there are those who prefer the 1st edition of the game, especially as it has a lot more content for it, but 2nd edition is generally considered by many in the community to be the cleanest rule set in the 40k RPG line from Fantasy Flight Games. The rules benefit from having many years of playtesting and iteration behind them, resulting in a smoother experience. Like the other 2nd generation games, 2nd edition Dark Heresy had significantly less expansion books printed for it, but thankfully each of the books that were released are indeed excellent, and the rules system very much feels like a complete package once you own all of them. Wrath and Glory is the current in-production RPG set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe and is a vast departure from the games that came before it. However, in an eerily similar repeat of history, Wrath and Glory, like Dark Heresy before it, was released by its publishers, in this case Ulysses Spiel, and then immediately abandoned. Gamers were left with a core rulebook which held the promise of a good game, but was very poorly laid out and difficult to read. Thankfully, not long after the game was dropped, it was picked up by industry veterans Cubicle 7, who vowed to keep the mechanics of the game but would completely overhaul the rulebook to make it easier to understand, in addition to tidying up some of the rules in the original release. After an in-depth development process where the player base was given the opportunity to provide plenty of feedback on the rulebook whilst being developed, Cubicle 7 has published its version of Wrath and Glory, and after a bit of a delay, the first expansion books have also been released for it. So what's it like to play? Unlike the previous games which each focus on a different aspect of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, Wrath and Glory has been designed as a universal system, which can be used to tell any story you want in the setting and allows players to create characters from a larger selection of races. It also plays very differently. Rather than using an in-depth percentile based system, Wrath and Glory uses a d6 pool system and is a much faster paced game. There is less emphasis on complicated rules designed to simulate a multitude of different things, and instead focuses more on action-paced narrative combat. It is considered by many to be a much simpler system, and as a result is the system that often ends up getting recommended to newer players and game masters purely from a mechanical standpoint. As the game is still new, the community as a whole is still making up its mind on it. Like any other game, it has its fans and detractors, but generally speaking, most would say that Wrath and Glory is much more accessible to people than the previous games, but this comes at the expense of mechanical depth, which for some is a benefit, but for others leads to the complaints of the game being a galaxy wide but only an inch deep. Despite this, it has the advantage of being in production and it's also early in its life cycle, meaning that over time, expansions will be released that should help flesh out the gaming experience. Hopefully, I've been able to provide you with a useful overview of each game system with this video. I've only provided a very brief look into each game as this video is long enough already, so if you've watched this far, thank you for watching. If you want to know more, I recommend joining the community subreddit and Discord, which I have linked in the description down below, and if you fancy picking up any of these games, you can find the PDFs for them on sale on DriveThruRPG, as well as physical copies of Wrath and Glory in gaming stores. In the future, I'll be making more videos of these games which will hopefully help provide you with more insight and information on them. If you're interested in finding out more, please feel to subscribe and click on the bell notification button below. I'll see you all in the next video.